Whatever happened to Freya? And also, what will happen to Freya? When I was considering to make this episode on Freya, I was actually going to Twitter first asking you guys if you think I should make it or wait until SPL. Votes are pretty much 50-50, but then Freya got played on the Energy Invitational, which actually was on a past patch, and she was pretty much banned in every single ranked game, so I figured, you know, might as well get to it. Now we're actually seeing Freya get yet another change, so we'll address that at the end of this video as well. But let's begin at the start. When it comes to balancing, Freya is probably one of the more interesting characters. Her kit in itself is very straightforward, very simple, and her abilities are relatively easy to land. She is designed in a way that generally makes her weak in early game and very strong in late game. And those late game carry guards are usually kinda awkward in the meta. Either they're very good or very bad, looking for example at guards like Artemis as well. Only that in addition to this, Freya also happens to be a magical ADC, of which we only have 3 in the game depending on how you want to see it. And well, magical basic attackers in themselves are rare, they use very specific items, and magical damage is usually a little bit favorable because most characters don't build as many magical protections, and as long as you have some flat shred to get through the flat protections, you are fine. As such, we have seen Freya constantly bounce up and down the meta with very different spikes in regards to her performance, also seeing her being played in different roles, sometimes more in jungle, sometimes more in ADC, and sometimes even in mid. If we look back at Season 3, Freya wasn't always a popular pick in that meta, but towards the end she definitely was. And this was interesting because in a patch 3.21 on November the 8th, where she was already pretty much overperforming or performing very, very well and one of the top picks out there at the point, she got a buff. The buff was justified as just being an adjustment that makes it more intuitive on how to play her, as the banish duration was changed from 1 to 2 seconds to 1.5 seconds flat at all ranks, so you'd always know how long you banish a target. Unfortunately, that meant that the banish was stronger on lower ranks, as it got 0.5 seconds extra over the first rank, which is where banish stays for the majority of the game, as obviously you want to level your damage abilities first. The mana cost was also reduced from 75 to 70 down to 50, so you even saved up a little bit of mana. Most people actually expected a nerf for her at that point, as she was already performing so well, so this was a very odd change to see, and she continued to perform very, very well until the end of the season. With Season 4, however, things changed. In patch 4.1, Freya got a nerf. Valkyrie's Discretion was nerfed, the base damage was decreased to 100 to 240 instead of 120 to 240, so a little less damage on the early ranks, making her early game even weaker than it already was. And that was always a weak spot no matter how well she did in the meta. The question was always more about when she came online. For quite a while, Freya was still a popular pick, but the longer the season went on, the more clear it became that other characters were just better at the same job. This was down to a few reasons. First of all, the minion spawn timers were changed, which required a different starting strategy and made it so that those characters who had very good level 1 clear would generally have higher lane pressure, and that would lead to very strong snowball. Snowball that Freya obviously did not have. Furthermore, while many gods saw favorable item changes for them, the changes for Freya were not that great. In 4.1, Demonic Grip saw a nerf, slight price increase, and it lost 5% attack speed, and this attack speed is very important for a character like Freya, who kinda depends on a few items to get her attack speed going, and doesn't really have as many options as physical characters in comparison. Additionally, Hasten Fatalis was changed. It was not necessarily a nerf at that point, it got 10 flat penetration and lost 10% attack speed, though it could be argued for Freya that due to her always using the Hasten Fatalis effect and pretty much always having Spear of the Magus on her build as well, she did not benefit as much from the penetration as others maybe did, simply due to the fact that she really needed that extra attack speed. Which could have actually come from another item, namely Shaman's Ring, which was introduced, which had 40 magical power and 30% attack speed. The unfortunate thing here was that it didn't really quite hold up to its expectations. The stats were not quite what you would need on a Freya, because really healing only does so much for you when you don't have the damage output and the pen behind it. So patch 4.1 didn't treat Freya all too well. In addition to that, quite a few other things happened throughout the season that indirectly affected Freya, which we'll just fast forward through a little bit. The first one being Sunder. Sunder was introduced and quickly became a popular item. Freya is pretty dependent on her defensive relics most of the time, so she couldn't really afford to build Sunder. At the same time, Sunder was a relic that could easily force her into her ultimate. It doesn't really matter if you have lifesteal on your character, such as Freya does, when Sunder immediately puts you at the threat of being bursted down before you can even utilize it. She works a little bit better in bursty fights with a little bit of a longer duration, and not one where you get blown up immediately. So other gods just benefited a lot more from Sunder than she did. Bracer was introduced, which worked pretty well against her. Freya does have that burst, but her burst is spread out over a few seconds, so it's not really DPS, but not really burst either, and Bracer is perfect against that. Freya's damage comes out in roughly 5 to 6 seconds between her 2 and her 1. Bracer heals up for the damage taken in 4 seconds. If you're not dead by the time that her steroids run out, all she has is her ultimate. As such, you use Bracer after she tried to burst you down or when she goes into her ult, and you heal up and you just trade against her afterwards, and she can't really do much against that. Additionally, Freya doesn't really have the typical anti-heal items that other gods have access to, or they don't fit as well into her build, so she can't counter Bracer as well either. So these two items are introduced, and then she was just also outclassed by other mage ADCs that just got the job done better, namely Sol and Kronos, who both got some changes throughout the season, and those changes kind of helped them in various regards. Then Haste and Fatalis also got changed further, and these changes were generally not in Freya's favor, as they were targeted against hunters and made the item more expensive, when Freya was also a very item dependent god. Sunder eventually got some nerfs, so that threat was kinda gone a little bit, and quite a few more things changed as we reach patch 4.13. The amount of favorable item changes for Freya in this patch is actually quite huge. First of all, Bracer of Undoing saw some minor nerfs, which aren't directly helpful for Freya, but they also made the item being picked up a little less. Also, Toxic Blade was introduced, which actually allowed her to counter Bracer of Undoing if she wanted to do so. Likewise, Witchblade was entirely changed, and the new stats were generally more favorable for Freya, allowing for no boots builds in late game, as many of the rings that she uses also got extra movement speed. With this item now having more attack speed, extra lifesteal and attack speed reduction for the enemies, it was really about time that it was recognized as a decent Freya pickup. And the same went for Vampiric Shroud. Mostly a jungle pickup, it now had physical protection as well as more healing in return for the lifesteal removed, which, while not a core item on Freya, made it more favorable for her as well. The two big deals were Demonic Grip and Hastened Ring though. Demonic Grip actually lost attack speed and got a little bit of power, which was not that beneficial for Freya, but at the same time got some extra movement speed. Hastened Ring, on the other hand, was the new version of Haste Fatalis, which would have 25% attack speed, pretty good for her, 50 magical power and 7% attack speed, and also the haste effect every 30 seconds. Now, many people, including me, weren't so sure how good she would really be, and the changes kinda felt like all those things didn't work too well. But that's only in the casual scene. In the pro scene, she actually was played in scrims, and apparently she was successfully played. In the Energy Invitational, Yaman tried to play her twice with a relatively unconventional build, Book of the Dead, Pen Boots and Obsidian Shard. Unfortunately, it wasn't successful, so we couldn't really see how it would have played out. Enter 4.14. Freya buffs all over the place. Attack speed increased from 0.95 to 1.0. Pulse damage increased from 20 to 60 to 30 to 70. Brace of Undoing nerfed further. Hastened Ring getting increase on the haste from 4 seconds to 6 seconds, which is exactly the duration of Freya's 2. The cooldown decreased from 30 seconds to 25 seconds. And Demonic Grip getting a price decrease with some power loss, but an extra 15% attack speed. That is more attack speed than at the start of the season, in addition to the fact that she had higher base attack speed, meaning that every attack speed item would also give her more attack speed with how attack speed works in Smite. As such, she had more basic attacks per steroid from the start of the game, and it only got worse along the game went, and that just made her a monster for a very short time. This short time, however, is about to come to an end. With patch 4.15, her base attack speed will be reduced to the original 0.95. The pulse damage is decreased by 5 per rank, so we're starting at 25 now and going up to 65, so we're in the middle of what we were before, meaning it puts her in line a lot more and makes her early game significantly weaker again, as she doesn't get those extra pulse swings. What these changes imply exactly is a little too early to say, but with pros having picked her beforehand, before all these buffs were even there, and Demonic still being in the same state, same as Haste and Ring, I do think that we have not seen the end of Freya yet, and she will remain in the meta. With that, thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, I hope this was insightful. If you like this, feel free to click the sub button and maybe the bell, it really helps me out. See you for the next one tomorrow. Duke Sloth, out.